Lifetime income beneficiary. Oh my goodness. You knew about this. How could you not tell me? I trusted you. Why? I understand. This ends now.
The morning I found another woman's name inside our family trust, my husband didn't even bother looking guilty. Charles simply stirred his coffee while I stared at the words, Vanessa Collins, lifetime income beneficiary. We had spent 42 years building that trust to protect our children and grandchildren, yet somehow his mistress now had a place in it. He must have expected tears shouting, or divorce papers. Instead, I quietly closed the folder, smiled across the breakfast table, and decided to wait for one thing, the annual trustee meeting. That was where the truth would finally cost him everything. If you've ever discovered a betrayal that changed the way you saw someone you loved, I'd truly like to hear your story. Please leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if stories about family justice and second chances speak to your heart, I hope you'll join us by subscribing. Sometimes the quietest people have the strongest ending to tell. People often assume that betrayal begins with a lie. In my experience, it begins with gratitude. That may sound strange, but after living 64 years and spending 42 of them married to the same man, I've learned that people rarely destroy what they're still grateful for. They destroy what they begin taking for granted. Charles Davenport and I weren't born into wealth. We weren't handed family money or old Southern estates. Everything we owned had grease stains, late-night sacrifices, unpaid bills, and exhausted prayers attached to it. When people in Charleston drove past Davenport Logistics headquarters today, they saw a polished glass building with our family name engraved across the entrance. I still saw the tiny garage where it all started. I met Charles during my junior year at the College of Charleston. He was handsome in an easy, confident way that made everyone around him feel comfortable. He wasn't the smartest man in the room, but he had something many successful people possess. He could convince others to believe in impossible ideas. He asked me on our first date after noticing that I always stayed late in the library balancing accounting problems. "You like numbers," he'd said with a grin. "I like answers. Then maybe you can help me figure out how to build $1 million company." I laughed because he was driving a pickup truck that barely survived the trip across campus. "I'll help," I told him. "But only if you promise never to stop working." He held out his hand. "Deal." Neither of us imagined that one casual promise would shape the next 4 decades of our lives. After graduation, we married in a small white church surrounded by fewer than 50 guests. My wedding ring wasn't expensive, neither was Charles's suit. What we lacked in money we made up for with determination. Charles borrowed enough money to buy a single used freight truck. I borrowed folding tables from my parents and converted our garage into an office. During the day, Charles made deliveries across South Carolina. At night, I handled invoices, taxes, payroll permits, insurance forms, and customer contracts. There were evenings when we'd both fall asleep over stacks of paperwork. Some weeks we couldn't afford dinner outside the house. Some months we wondered whether we'd lose everything. But every setback pushed us closer together instead of farther apart. When customers called after midnight because a shipment had been delayed, Charles climbed back into the truck without complaint. When banks refused additional financing, I rewrote business plans until someone finally agreed to listen. Neither of us ever asked who worked harder. There wasn't a scorecard. There was only us. Years passed. One truck became 3. 3 became 15. Then came warehouses, distribution centers, government contracts, regional partnerships. Eventually, Davenport Logistics employed more than 700 people across the Southeast. Reporters often interviewed Charles because he enjoyed speaking publicly. They loved his story, the American dream, one magazine called him. Charles always smiled for the cameras. He always thanked our employees. He always thanked our customers, and every single interview ended the same way. "I couldn't have done any of this without my wife." People assumed those words made me feel important. The truth is, I never needed public recognition. I knew what I'd contributed. Every contract that protected our company had passed through my hands. Every expansion loan had my calculations behind it. Every major investment had been debated around our own kitchen table. Charles sold the dream. I built the foundation beneath it. That balance worked beautifully for decades. When Michael was born, I converted part of my office into a nursery. Our son practically learned to crawl between filing cabinets. A few years later, Emily arrived. She spent afternoons coloring on old shipping manifests, while I balanced quarterly reports. Neither child ever complained that we weren't home enough. Because we were. Home simply happened to share a wall with our business. As the company grew, life slowly became easier. The mortgage disappeared. College savings accounts filled up. Vacations finally became possible. Yet Charles and I kept living below our means. Not because we enjoyed denying ourselves, because we'd spent too many years fearing that everything could disappear overnight. It was around our 25th wedding anniversary that Harold Whitmore first suggested establishing a family trust. Harold had been our attorney since Davenport Logistics consisted of one truck and two stubborn dreamers. He understood our business almost as well as we did. One afternoon, he spread several thick folders across the conference table. "You've reached a point," he explained, "where protecting your assets matters just as much as creating them." Charles leaned back. "You mean estate planning?" Harold nodded. "Yes, but more importantly, legacy planning." That word stayed with me. Legacy. Money eventually disappears. Businesses can fail. Buildings crumble. But values can outlive generations. Over the following months, Harold helped us establish the Davenport Family Trust. It wasn't designed merely to distribute money after we died. It existed to protect everything we'd spent our lives creating. The trust held company shares, commercial real estate, investment accounts, several charitable funds, our family home, even the lake cabin where our grandchildren later learned to fish. Every clause reflected long conversations around our dining room table. Charles insisted that future generations should always have opportunities. I insisted those opportunities should come with responsibility. Together we wrote rules meant to keep greed from destroying what sacrifice had built. The trust became more than legal paperwork. It became a promise. At every annual family meeting, Charles would raise his glass and repeat the same sentence. "Nothing matters more than family." Our children smiled every time. The grandchildren eventually memorized it. Even employees who attended company celebrations knew Charles loved saying those 5 words. Nothing matters more than family. For many years, I believed he meant them. As Michael grew older, he joined the business after earning an MBA. Unlike his father, Michael preferred operations over public speaking. He quietly improved warehouse efficiency and modernized inventory systems. Emily chose a different path. She became an estate planning attorney in Atlanta. I secretly admired that choice. She wanted to protect families rather than simply accumulate wealth. Watching both children succeed gave Charles and me tremendous pride. Or at least, I believed it gave both of us pride. Looking back now, I can see tiny cracks beginning to appear long before the earthquake. Charles started traveling more frequently. Board meetings multiplied. Weekend conferences became common. He insisted growth demanded constant networking. That explanation sounded reasonable. After all, successful companies required constant attention. But something else changed. Small things. He stopped asking my opinion before making routine financial decisions. He began scheduling executive meetings without inviting me. Sometimes I'd learn about major company initiatives only after employees congratulated me. At first, I blamed retirement. 3 years earlier, I'd stepped away from daily operations to give younger executives room to lead. Perhaps Charles simply assumed I no longer wanted to be involved. Whenever I asked questions, he smiled warmly. "You're finally getting a chance to relax, Willie." Only Charles still called me Willie. Everyone else used Wilhelmina. "You've earned the peaceful life." Peaceful. It sounded thoughtful. It sounded loving. Now I understand something I couldn't see then. Sometimes people don't push you aside with cruelty. Sometimes they do it with compliments. Little by little, decisions that had always belonged to both of us became decisions Charles made alone. I noticed, but I trusted him. After 42 years together, trust had become as natural as breathing. I never imagined the man who once promised we'd build everything side by side had quietly started building a future that no longer included me. And I certainly never imagined another woman was already standing inside that future waiting for my place. People often assume that betrayal begins with a lie. In my experience, it begins with gratitude. That may sound strange, but after living 64 years and spending 42 of them married to the same man, I've learned that people rarely destroy what they're still grateful for. They destroy what they begin taking for granted. Charles Davenport and I weren't born into wealth. We weren't handed family money or old Southern estates. Everything we owned had grease stains, late-night sacrifices, unpaid bills, and exhausted prayers attached to it. When people in Charleston drove past Davenport Logistics headquarters today, they saw a polished glass building with our family name engraved across the entrance. I still saw the tiny garage where it all started. I met Charles during my junior year at the College of Charleston. He was handsome in an easy, confident way that made everyone around him feel comfortable. He wasn't the smartest man in the room, but he had something many successful people possess. He could convince others to believe in impossible ideas. He asked me on our first date after noticing that I always stayed late in the library balancing accounting problems. "You like numbers?" he'd said with a grin. "I like answers." "Then maybe you can help me figure out how to build $1 million company." I laughed because he was driving a pickup truck that barely survived the trip across campus. "I'll help," I told him, "but only if you promise never to stop working." He held out his hand. "Deal." Neither of us imagined that one casual promise would shape the next 4 decades of our lives. After graduation, we married in a small white church surrounded by fewer than 50 guests. My wedding ring wasn't expensive, neither was Charles's suit. What we lacked in money we made up for with determination. Charles borrowed enough money to buy a single used freight truck. I borrowed folding tables from my parents and converted our garage into an office. During the day, Charles made deliveries across South Carolina. At night, I handled invoices, taxes, payroll permits, insurance forms, and customer contracts. There were evenings when we'd both fall asleep over stacks of paperwork. Some weeks we couldn't afford dinner outside the house. Some months we wondered whether we'd lose everything. But every setback pushed us closer together instead of farther apart. When customers called after midnight because a shipment had been delayed, Charles climbed back into the truck without complaint. When banks refused additional financing, I rewrote business plans until someone finally agreed to listen. Neither of us ever asked who worked harder. There wasn't a scorecard. There was only us. Years passed. One truck became three, three became 15, then came warehouses, distribution centers, government contracts, regional partnerships. Eventually, Davenport Logistics employed more than 700 people across the Southeast. Reporters often interviewed Charles because he enjoyed speaking publicly. They loved his story, the American dream, one magazine called him. Charles always smiled for the cameras. He always thanked our employees. He always thanked our customers. And every single interview ended the same way. "I couldn't have done any of this without my wife." People assumed those words made me feel important. The truth is, I never needed public recognition. I knew what I'd contributed. Every contract that protected our company had passed through my hands. Every expansion loan had my calculations behind it. Every major investment had been debated around our own kitchen table. Charles sold the dream. I built the foundation beneath it. That balance worked beautifully for decades. When Michael was born, I converted part of my office into a nursery. Our son practically learned to crawl between filing cabinets. A few years later, Emily arrived. She spent afternoons coloring on old shipping manifests while I balanced quarterly reports. Neither child ever complained that we weren't home enough, because we were. Home simply happened to share a wall with our business. As the company grew, life slowly became easier. The mortgage disappeared. College savings accounts filled up. Vacations finally became possible. Yet Charles and I kept living below our means. Not because we enjoyed denying ourselves, because we'd spent too many years fearing that everything could disappear overnight. It was around our 25th wedding anniversary that Harold Whitmore first suggested establishing a family trust. Harold had been our attorney since Davenport Logistics consisted of one truck and two stubborn dreamers. He understood our business almost as well as we did. One afternoon, he spread several thick folders across the conference table. "You've reached a point," he explained, "where protecting your assets matters just as much as creating them." Charles leaned back. "You mean estate planning?" Harold nodded. "Yes. But more importantly, legacy planning." That word stayed with me. Legacy. Money eventually disappears. Businesses can fail. Buildings crumble. But values. Values can outlive generations. Over the following months, Harold helped us establish the Davenport Family Trust. It wasn't designed merely to distribute money after we died. It existed to protect everything we'd spent our lives creating. The trust held company shares, commercial real estate, investment accounts, several charitable funds, our family home, even the lake cabin where our grandchildren later learned to fish. Every clause reflected long conversations around our dining room table. Charles insisted that future generations should always have opportunities. I insisted those opportunities should come with responsibility. Together we wrote rules meant to keep greed from destroying what sacrifice had built. The trust became more than legal paperwork. It became a promise. At every annual family meeting, Charles would raise his glass and repeat the same sentence: "Nothing matters more than family." Our children smiled every time. The grandchildren eventually memorized it. Even employees who attended company celebrations knew Charles loved saying those 5 words. Nothing matters more than family. For many years, I believed he meant them. As Michael grew older, he joined the business after earning an MBA. Unlike his father, Michael preferred operations over public speaking. He quietly improved warehouse efficiency and modernized inventory systems. Emily chose a different path. She became an estate planning attorney in Atlanta. I secretly admired that choice. She wanted to protect families rather than simply accumulate wealth. Watching both children succeed gave Charles and me tremendous pride. Or at least, I believed it gave both of us pride. Looking back now, I can see tiny cracks beginning to appear long before the earthquake. Charles started traveling more frequently. Board meetings multiplied. Weekend conferences became common. He insisted growth demanded constant networking. That explanation sounded reasonable. After all, successful companies required constant attention. But something else changed. Small things. He stopped asking my opinion before making routine financial decisions. He began scheduling executive meetings without inviting me. Sometimes I'd learn about major company initiatives only after employees congratulated me. At first, I blamed retirement. 3 years earlier, I'd stepped away from daily operations to give younger executives room to lead. Perhaps Charles simply assumed I no longer wanted to be involved. Whenever I asked questions, he smiled warmly. "You're finally getting a chance to relax, Willie." Only Charles still called me Willie. Everyone else used Wilhelmina. "You've earned the peaceful life." Peaceful. It sounded thoughtful. It sounded loving. Now I understand something I couldn't see then. Sometimes people don't push you aside with cruelty. Sometimes they do it with compliments. Little by little, decisions that had always belonged to both of us became decisions Charles made alone. I noticed. But I trusted him. After 42 years together, trust had become as natural as breathing. I never imagined the man who once promised we'd build everything side by side had quietly started building a future that no longer included me. And I certainly never imagined another woman was already standing inside that future waiting for my place. If someone had asked me to describe Vanessa Collins before everything fell apart, I would have said she was forgettable. Not because she lacked beauty, quite the opposite. She was the kind of woman people noticed the moment she walked into a room. She carried herself with polished confidence, wore tailored business suits that looked custom-made, and somehow always appeared perfectly composed even during stressful meetings. No. What made her seem forgettable to me was something else. I never believed she mattered. That was my first mistake. The first time I heard her name, Charles mentioned it over dinner as casually as someone discussing the weather. "We've hired an outside consultant." I glanced up from my salad. "For what operations?" I smiled. I thought Michael was handling operations now. "He is." Charles reached for the pepper grinder. "But fresh perspectives never hurt." That sounded reasonable enough. Companies our size often hired consultants. They reviewed efficiency, recommended new technology, analyzed expansion opportunities. Nothing unusual. "What company is she with?" Charles shrugged. "Independent." That was the entire conversation. Looking back now, I realize how expertly he controlled information. He never lied. He simply never volunteered details. Weeks passed before I met Vanessa. It happened during a quarterly executive luncheon. I had stopped by headquarters to review paperwork for one of our charitable foundations. Although I no longer worked there full-time, I still maintained oversight of several family initiatives connected to the trust. As I stepped into the executive conference room, Charles stood immediately. "There she is." Everyone smiled. Michael walked over and hugged me. "Good to see you, Mom." I greeted department heads I'd known for decades before noticing a young woman organizing presentation materials near the screen. Charles waved toward her. "Wilhelmina, I'd like you to meet Vanessa Collins." She extended her hand. "It's an honor to finally meet you." Her voice was warm without sounding overly familiar. "I've heard wonderful things about you." I smiled politely. "I hope only the true ones." She laughed. "Oh, definitely the true ones." Nothing about the interaction felt inappropriate. If anything, Vanessa seemed almost overly respectful. Throughout lunch, she contributed thoughtful observations about warehouse automation and supply chain forecasting. She was intelligent, prepared, professional. Even I had to admit that. Driving home that afternoon, I found myself thinking Charles had made a good hiring decision. The next several months passed without much thought. Then I started noticing something strange. Vanessa wasn't appearing only in operational meetings. She attended marketing reviews, budget discussions, board strategy sessions, vendor negotiations. She even accompanied Charles to charitable fundraising dinners, where consultants had absolutely no reason to be present. One evening I asked casually, "Does Vanessa handle public relations now?" Charles looked confused. "What do you mean? She seems to be everywhere." He chuckled. "She's versatile." That answer felt incomplete. Still, I let it go. Over the years, I'd learned not to question every management decision. Charles knew how to run people. I knew how to run numbers. That partnership had always worked. Or so I believed. About 6 months later, Jennifer invited me to lunch. She rarely called unexpectedly. Michael's wife wasn't dramatic by nature. She preferred peace, which was exactly why I noticed her nervousness. After ordering sandwiches, she stirred her iced tea for nearly a minute before speaking. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Has Charles ever talked to you about Vanessa?" I smiled. "The consultant." Jennifer nodded slowly. "Yes." "What about her?" She hesitated. "I don't know." "Know what?" Jennifer looked around the restaurant before lowering her voice. "There are stories." I laughed softly. "Office gossip." "I hope so." "What kind of stories?" Jennifer stared down at the table. "People think they're spending a lot of time together." I leaned back. "They work together." "I know." "So that's hardly surprising." She nodded. "I suppose." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Jennifer, successful people attract rumors." She forced a smile. "I hope you're right." I truly believed I was. When you've trusted someone for 40 years, suspicion doesn't come naturally. Trust becomes your default setting. You explain away inconsistencies because your heart refuses to rewrite decades of certainty overnight. Several weeks later, I attended a charity gala benefiting children's hospitals across South Carolina. Charles was receiving a Community Leadership Award. I arrived separately because I'd spent the afternoon helping Emily prepare documents for one of her nonprofit clients. The ballroom buzzed with conversation. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across white linen tables. I searched the room for Charles. Instead, I found him standing near the stage laughing with Vanessa. They weren't touching. They weren't whispering. Nothing looked openly romantic. Yet something unsettled me. It wasn't what they were doing. It was how naturally they occupied each other's space. She laughed before he finished speaking. He leaned toward her without realizing it. She adjusted his tie just before photographs were taken. A wife notices those things. No one teaches you how. 42 years of marriage become their own language. That evening, Charles introduced Vanessa to several donors. "This is one of the brightest consultants I've ever worked with." His pride sounded unusually personal. One donor smiled at me. "You must be thrilled Charles found someone this talented," I answered politely. Talent is always worth appreciating. Inside, though, a tiny knot tightened. Driving home later, I asked, "Does she really need to attend charity events?" Charles kept his eyes on the road. "Networking matters. Even for consultants. Especially for consultants." His answer came too quickly. That was the first time I wondered whether I was asking the wrong questions. Over the following months, the changes became impossible to ignore. Charles began traveling almost every other week. Business conferences, leadership summits, industry conventions. Whenever I suggested joining him, there was always a reason I shouldn't. "It'll be boring. You deserve a break. The schedule is exhausting." Eventually, I stopped asking. One afternoon, I visited headquarters unexpectedly to deliver paperwork for Thomas Reed, our chief financial officer. As I walked past the executive parking area, I noticed a sleek silver Mercedes parked in a reserved company space. The temporary permit displayed one name, Vanessa Collins. I frowned. Consultants rarely received permanent executive parking privileges. Inside the building, receptionists greeted me warmly. One young assistant smiled. "Mrs. Davenport, Mr. Davenport is upstairs." "Thank you." As I reached the executive floor, I heard laughter echoing from Charles's office. His door stood slightly open. Vanessa was sitting across from him. The conversation stopped the instant they noticed me. Charles stood immediately. "Willie." His smile appeared a fraction too quickly. "What a surprise." "I was dropping off documents." Vanessa gathered her tablet. "I should probably head out." "There isn't any rush," Charles said. She smiled politely. "I'll let you two catch up." As she walked past me, she smelled faintly of the same cologne Charles had started wearing several months earlier. A ridiculous observation. People often bought fragrances from the same department stores. Still, the coincidence lingered. After she left, Charles seemed unusually eager to discuss routine business. He talked continuously: revenue projections, fuel costs, warehouse construction, almost as though silence itself frightened him. When someone over-explains ordinary situations, they're usually trying to distract you from something extraordinary. I simply hadn't recognized it yet. The real turning point came entirely by accident. About 3 weeks later, Thomas Reed called. "Mrs. Davenport, I'm sorry to bother you." "It's all right. I think accounting accidentally sent one of next month's expense reports to your email. I'll delete it." "You don't have to. I just wanted to let you know." After hanging up, I opened the attachment intending to remove it. Years of financial habit made me glance through the report first. Most entries were routine: travel reimbursements, vendor payments, equipment leases. Then one line stopped me. Luxury apartment lease. Executive housing program. Annual cost, $84, $600. Occupant, Vanessa Collins. I stared at the screen for a long time. Consultants sometimes receive temporary housing, but not penthouse apartments overlooking Charleston Harbor. Not leases costing more than many employees earned in a year. I kept reading. Utilities, parking, furniture rental, housekeeping services. Every payment had been approved personally by Charles Davenport. For the first time since our marriage began, I didn't dismiss the feeling growing inside me. I didn't tell myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. I didn't assume I was overreacting. Instead, I quietly printed the report, folded it in half, placed it inside my purse. Then I looked out the office window toward the city we'd spent 42 years building together. For the first time, I wondered whether the greatest threat to everything we had created wasn't outside our company at all. It was sitting in my husband's office wearing a tailored navy suit and answering to the name Vanessa Collins. I spent 3 days pretending that nothing had changed. It wasn't because I enjoyed living with uncertainty. It was because I had learned something about Charles over 42 years of marriage. When he believed he was winning, he became careless. The man who once checked every decimal point in a contract had gradually developed another habit. Success had convinced him that no one questioned his decisions anymore. Employees admired him. Community leaders celebrated him. Even our own children often accepted his explanations without asking a second question. Confidence has a dangerous way of turning into overconfidence, and overconfidence leaves fingerprints. Every morning after discovering the apartment payments, I followed the same routine. I made breakfast, watered the flowers outside our kitchen window, kissed Charles goodbye, and watched him drive toward headquarters. He never suspected that after his car disappeared around the corner, I climbed into my own sedan and drove somewhere else entirely. On the fourth morning, that destination was Harold Whitmore's law office. Harold had occupied the same historic brick building in downtown Charleston for nearly 30 years. The brass plaque outside still read, Whitmore and Associates Estate Planning, Business Law, Family Trusts. The receptionist smiled the moment I walked through the front door. Mrs. Davenport, Mr. Whitmore has been expecting you. I frowned. Expecting me? She nodded politely. When you called yesterday. Right. In the middle of everything happening, I'd almost forgotten making the appointment. Harold was standing beside his office window when I entered. At 71, his hair had become completely white, but his posture remained remarkably straight. He wore reading glasses low on his nose and greeted me with the same gentle smile he'd worn since Charles and I were barely 30 years old. Wilhelmina. It's been too long. He motioned toward the chair across from his desk. I wish this visit were under happier circumstances. I sat slowly. So do I. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Experienced attorneys understand silence. Sometimes clients need permission to begin difficult conversations. Finally, I reached into my purse and placed the printed expense report on his desk. I found this. Harold adjusted his glasses. He read every line without interrupting. When he finished, he folded the paper carefully. What exactly concerns you? The apartment, he nodded. I assumed as much. And the woman? Another slow nod. I see. I looked directly into his eyes. Harold, I need you to answer one question honestly. I always have. Has Charles changed our family trust? The office became very quiet. Instead of answering immediately, Harold opened a locked drawer beneath his desk. He removed a thick blue folder. My stomach tightened. He placed the folder between us. The trust has received a proposed amendment. The word proposed echoed in my mind. Not completed, not finalized. Proposed. I slowly opened the folder. Inside were documents bearing the familiar title, the Davenport Family Trust. I recognized my own signature from 22 years earlier. Then I noticed another packet clipped behind the original agreement. Its pages looked newer. Fresh paper. Recent printing. At the top appeared a heading that made my heart pound. First Amendment to the Davenport Family Trust. My hands suddenly felt cold. Harold remained silent while I turned the pages. There were revisions regarding investment authority, administrative language, several tax updates, nothing alarming. Then I reached page 11. One paragraph had been highlighted. I read it once, then again, then a third time. I still wished I had misunderstood. Lifetime income beneficiary Vanessa Collins. There it was. Her name. Black ink on white paper. As permanent as betrayal itself. I stared at it for several seconds before asking, when? Harold answered quietly. The amendment was drafted approximately 4 months ago. 4 months. For 4 entire months, Charles had known another woman's future had been written into documents we created together. He had eaten dinner across from me, celebrated birthdays, held our granddaughter during Thanksgiving, looked me in the eye every morning, all while carrying this secret. I closed the folder. Did you prepare this? Harold surprised me. No. You didn't. No. Then who did see a different law firm? That answer somehow hurt even more. Charles hadn't simply hidden documents. He had deliberately hired attorneys who didn't know our history, people who wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions. Harold folded his hands together. I only received notice because I remain counsel of record for the original trust. So why hasn't this already taken effect? Because the amendment hasn't completed the approval process. I leaned forward. What does that mean? He opened another section of the file. The Davenport Family Trust is governed by independent trustees. I know that. Any significant amendment affecting beneficiaries requires presentation during the annual trustee meeting. So the trustees review it. They vote, essentially. I looked back at Vanessa's name. So this isn't final. No. Relief washed through me so suddenly that I almost cried. Not because the problem had disappeared, because there was still time. Harold continued carefully. Charles appears to believe approval will be routine. Why? He likely assumes no one will object. I laughed softly. That sounds like him. Harold studied my face. What are you planning to do? I answered honestly. I don't know yet. That wasn't entirely true. Part of me wanted to drive straight to headquarters, march into Charles's office, throw the documents onto his desk, demand every explanation he owed me. 42 years deserved at least that much. Didn't they? As though reading my thoughts, Harold spoke. If I may offer advice, please, don't confront him today. I looked up. Why not? Because right now you know almost nothing. I know enough. You know there's an amendment. Isn't that enough? He shook his head. You don't know how it was prepared. You don't know who else knows. You don't know what supporting documents exist. You don't know what financial decisions may be connected. He paused. And you certainly don't know what Charles will do once he realizes you've discovered it. That last sentence settled heavily between us. Harold wasn't protecting Charles, he was protecting me. For decades, I'd respected him because he never let emotion replace strategy. Even now, with my marriage unraveling in front of me, he remained the calmest person in the room. He reached for another document. This is the meeting agenda. I scanned the pages. The annual trustee meeting was scheduled for exactly 23 days later. 23. Not months, not weeks, just over 3 weeks. Agenda item 7, read review and vote on proposed trust amendment. Harold tapped the page. That is when the amendment will be discussed. I nodded slowly. And until then, you have choices. What kind of choices? You can confront Charles. You can begin gathering information. You can prepare legal objections. Or, he hesitated, or, you can do nothing and hope the amendment is withdrawn voluntarily. I almost smiled. Charles had spent enough years in business to understand one simple rule. People rarely abandon plans they've already invested themselves in. If he had gone this far, he intended to finish. I closed the folder. I have one more question. Of course. Does Charles know you and I met today? No. Will you tell him? Harold answered immediately. Attorney-client privilege still exists, Wilhelmina. For the first time that morning, I felt completely safe. As I stood to leave, Harold handed me a copy of the amendment. Keep this. I accepted it carefully. Then he said something I would remember for the rest of my life. Winning emotional battles is easy. I waited. Winning legal ones requires patience. Driving home through downtown Charleston, I replayed every conversation Charles and I had shared over the past year. Every unexpected business trip, every unexplained dinner, every delayed meeting, every compliment about how much I deserved to relax. The pattern suddenly became painfully clear. He hadn't been encouraging retirement. He had been removing me from the places where questions might be asked. By the time I reached our driveway, my sadness had transformed into something quieter, something steadier. I parked the car, sat behind the steering wheel for nearly 5 minutes. Then I looked at the thick folder resting on the passenger seat. I finally understood why Charles had been acting so confidently. He believed the annual trustee meeting would simply be another formality, another vote. Another signature. Another victory. He expected me to arrive as a trusting wife. He had absolutely no idea I would arrive carrying the very documents he hoped I would never see. I picked up the folder, smiled to myself for the first time in weeks, and whispered 4 words that would change everything. Let him keep believing. There is something far more painful than discovering your spouse has betrayed you. It is discovering how many people already knew. For almost 2 weeks after meeting with Harold Whitmore, I carried on exactly as I always had. I cooked dinner every evening. I attended church every Sunday. I called Emily twice a week just as I had for years. I visited my grandchildren whenever they asked. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, however, every conversation felt different. Once doubt enters your heart, it rewrites your memories. A compliment begins sounding rehearsed. A smile becomes suspicious. Even ordinary silence starts asking questions. Charles never seemed nervous. If anything, he appeared happier than he had in years. He hummed while shaving. He volunteered to cook breakfast one Saturday morning. He even suggested we spend a weekend at our lake cabin. 20 years earlier, those gestures would have made me feel loved. Now they made me wonder whether guilt was trying to disguise itself as kindness. One Tuesday afternoon, Jennifer called unexpectedly. "Mrs. Davenport, you know you can call me Wilhelmina." She laughed softly. "I've tried. You always tell me that." "I know." There was an awkward pause. "Would you have lunch with me tomorrow?" "Of course. Just us." Her voice sounded unusually hesitant. "Is everything all right?" I I just think we should talk." The way she emphasized the word talk told me this wasn't about family birthdays or Benjamin's school projects. We met at a quiet cafe overlooking the Ashley River. Jennifer arrived nearly 15 minutes early. I could tell because she had already finished half a glass of iced tea before I walked in. She smiled when she saw me, but it wasn't her usual warm smile. It looked tired, almost guilty. After ordering lunch, neither of us touched the menus again. Finally, she spoke. "I don't know how to do this." I folded my hands together. "Start wherever you need to." Jennifer stared out the window. "I think I've waited too long already." Those words settled heavily between us. "What do you mean?" She inhaled slowly. "Michael and I argued about this months ago." My heart tightened. "About what?" She looked directly at me. "Your marriage." For several seconds I couldn't answer. Not because I didn't understand. Because I did. "You knew." It wasn't a question. Jennifer lowered her eyes. "I suspected." "When?" she whispered. "Last winter." Nearly 8 months. 8 months. I felt as though someone had quietly removed the air from the room. "What made you suspicious?" "I saw them together." "Together how?" "They came out of a restaurant downtown." I waited. "They weren't holding hands. They weren't kissing." But, but, Jennifer swallowed. "They looked like people who didn't realize anyone else existed." I stared at the tablecloth. A strange calm settled over me. Not anger, not yet. Only exhaustion. "Did you tell Michael?" She nodded. "The same night." "What did he say?" Jennifer looked miserable. "He thought we should stay out of it." "Why?" "He said maybe we misunderstood." "Did you believe that?" "No." "Then why didn't you tell me?" Her eyes immediately filled with tears. "I wanted to. Every single day I wanted to." "So why didn't you?" She covered her face for a moment before answering. "Because Michael begged me not to." I closed my eyes. Our son. The little boy who used to run into my office carrying scraped knees and broken toys because he believed I could fix anything. Now he had chosen silence. Jennifer reached across the table. "I'm so sorry." I gently squeezed her hand. "I know you are." She began crying quietly. "I kept thinking Charles would end it. I thought maybe it was temporary. I convinced myself there had to be an explanation." I almost smiled. Isn't that remarkable? The same lies I had told myself. She had told herself too. Hope can be an incredibly persuasive liar. When lunch ended, Jennifer hugged me tightly. I never wanted to hurt you. I know. But I did. I kissed her forehead. You aren't the one who broke your promises. Driving home, I realized something uncomfortable. Jennifer wasn't the only person carrying guilt. That afternoon, I called Michael. Can you stop by after work? Everything okay, Mom? I'd rather talk in person. He arrived around 6 o'clock. The moment he stepped inside, I knew Jennifer had spoken to him. His shoulders were tense. He wouldn't meet my eyes. We sat on the back porch overlooking the garden I'd planted decades earlier. The roses were beginning to bloom. Normally, I'd have admired them. That evening, I barely noticed. Michael broke the silence first. Jennifer told you. She did. He nodded once. I'm sorry. I studied my son carefully. At 42, he looked so much like Charles that sometimes it startled me. Same jawline, same posture, same habit of rubbing the back of his neck when uncomfortable. What exactly are you sorry for? He answered honestly. For staying quiet. Not for what your father did. His expression hardened. I can't control him. No. But you could have warned me. He stared toward the garden. I kept hoping he'd come to his senses. Did you ask him? Michael nodded. Twice. What did he say? He told me it wasn't my business. That sounded exactly like Charles. And then, I backed off. I waited. He finally looked at me. I shouldn't have. No, you shouldn't have. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then Michael asked the question I had been expecting. How much do you know? I considered lying. Instead, I answered carefully. I know enough. His face immediately lost color. So it was true. He lowered his head. I wanted to believe it wasn't. When did you stop believing that? The company Christmas party. What happened? Michael sighed deeply. Dad introduced Vanessa to investors as though she already belonged in the family. I remembered that evening. I had been home recovering from a bad case of influenza. Charles insisted I stay home and rest. Vanessa had attended in my place. Another memory suddenly changed shape. At the time, I'd thought my husband was protecting my health. Now I wondered whether he had simply wanted someone else beside him. Michael interrupted my thoughts. I should have told you. Why didn't you? He answered with heartbreaking honesty. I was afraid. Of your father. He nodded. I didn't want to destroy our family. The irony almost made me laugh. Keeping secrets had destroyed it far more effectively than truth ever could. I stood and walked toward the garden. Michael followed. Mom, yes. Are you leaving him? There it was. The question everyone must have been asking. I looked at one of the oldest rose bushes in the yard. Charles had planted it on our 10th wedding anniversary. It still bloomed every spring, even after years of neglect. I haven't decided. Can I ask something? You just did. He smiled weakly. I mean, he hesitated. What are you going to do? I thought about Harold, the trust amendment, the annual meeting, the folder locked safely inside my desk. Then I looked back at my son. I'm going to wait. For what? The right moment. He frowned. What does that mean? It means your father thinks he understands the game. And he doesn't realize I'm finally playing it. Michael looked confused. I wasn't surprised. He still believed this was about a marriage. It wasn't. Not anymore. Marriages could survive infidelity. Some even recovered. But what Charles had done reached far beyond another relationship. He had tried to rewrite our family's legacy. He had tried to place someone completely outside our bloodline into a trust built through 42 years of shared sacrifice. That wasn't simply betrayal. It was theft disguised as estate planning. The next morning, I visited Harold again. He greeted me with his usual calm expression. You've learned something. How could you tell? You look disappointed. I smiled sadly. I discovered almost everyone knew. Harold nodded as though he'd expected exactly that answer. They often do. Why? Because secrets require witnesses. I sat down across from his desk. I want to see the original trust documents again. Without asking another question, Harold unlocked the filing cabinet. As he placed the thick binder in front of me, I noticed another folder beside it. Its tab read, Supporting Correspondence. I looked at him. What's that? Harold adjusted his glasses. Letters. From whom? People involved when the trust was first created. I stared at the folder. Something told me those old letters contained answers Charles had completely forgotten. And perhaps the very mistake that would eventually bring his entire plan crashing down. I have always believed that paper remembers what people conveniently forget. Memories become unreliable, stories change, promises fade. But ink has a stubborn way of refusing to cooperate with lies. As Harold Whitmore placed the thick binder in front of me for the second time that week, I realized I was no longer searching for proof that Charles had betrayed me. I already had that. Now I needed to understand whether he had also betrayed the law. Harold slid another pair of reading glasses across the desk. You'll want these. I smiled faintly. I didn't realize the truth required stronger lenses. He smiled back. Sometimes it does. The original Davenport Family Trust was nearly 200 pages long. 22 years earlier, Charles and I had spent months reviewing every clause, every definition, and every contingency. At the time, I had joked that estate planning was more exhausting than building the company itself. Harold had laughed. You'll thank me 20 years from now. Neither of us imagined how right he would be. I began reading slowly. The first sections covered the obvious: trust purpose, definitions, management authority, distribution procedures, investment standards. Most of it I already remembered. Then Harold quietly placed a yellow sticky note beside one page. I suggest starting here. I turned to Article 3. The heading read, Creation of the Trust and Identity of the Settlers. My eyes moved carefully across the page. The Davenport Family Trust is hereby established jointly by Charles Edward Davenport and Wilhelmina Grace Davenport, hereafter collectively referred to as the original settlers. Jointly, not primarily by Charles, not administered under Charles, jointly. I looked up. I knew we both created it. Harold nodded. Keep reading. Several paragraphs later, another sentence caught my attention. The intentions of both original settlers shall remain the controlling purpose of this trust, unless modified according to procedures specifically outlined herein. Again, both. Not one. Both. Harold folded his hands. Many married couples create trusts where one spouse maintains primary authority. We didn't know. Why? He smiled. Because you insisted otherwise. I did. He opened another folder. Inside lay handwritten meeting notes from more than 2 decades earlier. The handwriting was unmistakably mine. I read aloud. If one of us ever loses judgment, becomes manipulated, or acts against the family's interests, neither should have unlimited power. I stared at the page. I wrote that. You certainly did. I don't even remember writing it. Harold leaned back. You were very firm. I remember one conversation in particular. What conversation? You told Charles that love was wonderful. I laughed softly. That sounds like me. But legal documents should never rely on love. Now I remembered. Very clearly. Back then we had both been healthy. Our business had just expanded into Georgia. Money was finally becoming abundant. Friends kept warning us that wealth often destroyed families after the founders passed away. Charles believed our children would always make wise decisions. I wasn't so optimistic. I believed good people could make terrible decisions under the wrong circumstances. That's why I wanted safeguards. Not because I expected betrayal. Because I understood human weakness. I continued reading. Article 4. Trustee Authority. Investment Authority. Voting Procedures. Everything looked familiar. Then Harold quietly turned another page. Article 9. I noticed the title immediately. Restrictions on Beneficiary Modifications. My heartbeat slowed. This felt important. The opening paragraph stated that family descendants could receive revised distributions under specific conditions. Reasonable enough. Then came section 9.4. Harold didn't interrupt. He simply waited. I read every word carefully. Once, twice, 3 times. Each reading made the meaning even clearer. No amendment adding any person outside the bloodline or legally adopted descendants of the original settlers as a continuing income beneficiary shall become effective without written approval executed by both original settlers provided both remain legally competent. I looked up slowly. Both. Harold nodded. Yes. I never signed anything. No. I never even knew about the amendment. Correct. I looked back down. If one original settler is deceased or permanently incapacitated, documentation establishing such condition shall accompany any proposed amendment. Charles was alive. I was alive. Neither of us had been declared incompetent. The requirement was unmistakable. My written approval, not implied approval, not assumed approval, written, signed, documented. I leaned back in my chair. Then Vanessa can't legally become a beneficiary, Harold answered cautiously. Not under the trust as it currently exists. A strange mixture of relief and anger washed over me. Relief because Charles's plan wasn't complete. Anger because he had either ignored or intentionally concealed a clause he knew perfectly well existed. Would another attorney have noticed this? Harold considered the question. If they reviewed only the amendment package Charles provided, they might not. If they relied upon summaries rather than the original governing instrument, they could miss it. So Charles may have counted on that. Harold didn't answer directly. He didn't need to. The silence itself answered. I looked toward the office window. Traffic moved peacefully along Meeting Street. People walked dogs. Tourists admired old buildings. Somewhere across town, Charles was probably conducting meetings as though nothing had happened. He likely believed his plan was progressing exactly as intended. The thought almost made me smile, because for the first time, I possessed something he didn't. Knowledge. Harold reached toward another folder. There's more. I thought this was enough. It may be. But I believe you'll appreciate the context. He opened the folder labeled Supporting Correspondence. Inside were photocopies of letters exchanged while the trust was being drafted. Some were from accountants, others from tax specialists. One envelope immediately caught my attention. The front read, Personal Memorandum, Wilhelmina Davenport. I frowned. I wrote myself a memorandum. You dictated it. I transcribed it after one of our planning meetings. He handed it to me. The date read 22 years earlier. My younger self had written, Our greatest risk will never be market crashes or lawsuits. It will be believing our family could never betray itself. The trust must protect future generations from strangers, but it must also protect them from poor decisions made by the people they love most. I stopped reading. Goosebumps covered my arms. I actually said that. Harold smiled gently. You did. I thought I was being overly cautious. You were being realistic. Another memory surfaced unexpectedly. During one planning session, Charles had laughed. Willie, you sound like you're preparing for a family civil war. I'd laughed too. I hope these clauses never matter. Charles had kissed my forehead. They won't. Neither of us had imagined another woman would someday become the very reason those clauses existed. I carefully returned the memorandum to its folder. Does Charles remember any of this? Harold sighed. I honestly don't know. I thought about my husband, his confidence, his certainty, his growing habit of dismissing details. Success changes people, not always dramatically. Sometimes it simply convinces them they're too experienced to reread what they once signed. Harold interrupted my thoughts. There's one final issue. What issue? The trustee meeting. What about it? You should assume Charles has already spoken privately with several trustees. I nodded, trying to persuade them. Possibly. Does that matter? Not if the amendment fails legally. He paused. But appearances matter. I understood immediately. If I walked into that meeting looking emotional, angry, or vindictive, people might assume I was simply reacting to an affair. If I walked in calm, prepared, focused on legal obligations rather than personal revenge, everything would look different. This wasn't about punishing an unfaithful husband. It was about protecting the integrity of a family trust. That distinction mattered, more than I had realized. As I prepared to leave, Harold handed me certified copies of 3 documents: the original trust, Article 9, my memorandum. I placed them carefully inside a leather portfolio. Then I stopped at the door. Harold. Yes. Do you think Charles intentionally ignored this clause? He took longer to answer than I expected. Finally, he said, I think Charles has spent so many years believing he was the smartest man in every room, that he forgot who helped write the room. I smiled for the first time in days. Driving home, I didn't feel victorious. Not yet. I felt something much more valuable. Grounded. Charles still believed he controlled the future. Vanessa probably believed she would soon become part of our family's legacy. Neither of them understood that more than 2 decades earlier, I had quietly built a safeguard into the trust, not because I expected betrayal, but because I understood that power could change even good people. Now that forgotten safeguard had become the strongest protection our family had left. And for the first time since finding Vanessa's name inside our trust, I no longer wondered whether I could stop Charles. I knew I could. The only question remaining was how much of the truth I should reveal when the annual meeting finally began. Knowledge alone never wins a battle. Preparation does. By the time I walked out of Harold Whitmore's office, with certified copies of the original trust documents tucked safely inside my leather portfolio, I understood something that had never mattered to me before. Truth and proof are not the same thing. I knew Charles had betrayed me. I knew he had tried to place Vanessa Collins inside the Davenport family trust. I knew he had ignored a clause requiring my written approval. But knowing those things inside my own heart would never be enough inside a trustee meeting. Facts had to be organized. Evidence had to tell a story. Every answer needed a document. Every accusation needed proof. If Charles intended to present himself as the reasonable businessman and me as the emotional wife, I couldn't give him that opportunity. I would arrive prepared, not angry, not dramatic, prepared. That realization completely changed the way I approached the next 2 weeks. Instead of crying, I built files. Instead of arguing, I collected records. Instead of watching Charles with followed paper. Paper never lies. The following Monday, I visited headquarters for what everyone assumed was an ordinary meeting with our charitable foundation. No one questioned my presence. After all, my name still appeared on every major philanthropic program the Davenport family supported. Employees greeted me exactly as they always had. Receptionists smiled. Warehouse supervisors stopped to ask about my grandchildren. Drivers waved from the loading docks. Walking through the building felt strangely comforting. This company had been my second home longer than many employees had been alive. Every hallway contained memories. The conference room where Charles and I negotiated our first $1 million contract. The accounting office where Michael had completed his high school internship. The break room where Emily once sold homemade cookies to raise money for her debate team. I wasn't walking through a business. I was walking through my life. Thomas Reed met me outside his office. He closed the door quietly behind us. Mrs. Davenport? You can still call me Wilhelmina. He smiled politely. Old habits. Thomas had served as our chief financial officer for nearly 18 years. Unlike Charles, he rarely spoke more than necessary. He believed numbers should do the talking. That was one reason I'd always trusted him. He noticed the folder beneath my arm. I assume you've met with Harold. I have. His expression didn't change. I thought you might. I studied him carefully. You knew something was wrong, Thomas answered honestly. I suspected. There was that word again. Suspected. Apparently everyone in Charleston had suspected, except the woman sharing Charles's bed every night. I need your help. If it's legal, it is. If it isn't, the answer is no. I smiled. I wouldn't expect anything else. He waited. I'd like copies of every corporate reimbursement connected to Vanessa Collins. Thomas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the closed office door, then back at me. Do you have authorization? I have standing as co-founder. You do. And he took a slow breath. If Charles discovers I provided records without informing him, I know, Thomas nodded. It could cost me my job. I understand. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he surprised me. I'll do it. You will. I work for Davenport Logistics. He paused. Not Charles Davenport. That distinction mattered, more than he probably realized. Thomas unlocked a secure cabinet and began retrieving files. There are expense reports. He placed one stack on the desk. Travel authorizations. Another stack. Corporate credit card statements. Then another. Housing reimbursements. A fourth pile. By the time he finished, nearly 3 inches of paperwork covered his desk. This is everything. He shook his head. This is only the last 18 months. I looked at the documents in disbelief. There are more, much more. The realization made my stomach tighten. Vanessa hadn't entered Charles's life recently. She had been slowly woven into it. Thomas pulled one file toward us. You should see this first. Inside was a spreadsheet listing executive travel. Most trips appeared ordinary. Atlanta, Charlotte, Nashville, Dallas. Then Thomas pointed toward highlighted entries. Notice something. I looked carefully. Every conference attended by Charles during the previous year included another traveler. Vanessa Collins. Different flights, different reservations, same destination, every single time. They always booked separate hotel rooms, Thomas said quietly. I looked up. You checked? I had to approve reimbursement requests. He hesitated. But, the hotels often billed both rooms to one executive account. I understood immediately. That meant Charles wasn't even trying to hide the expenses from accounting. He simply assumed no one would question them. Success had made him careless, exactly as Harold predicted. Thomas opened another folder. This one bothered me. Inside were invoices from an upscale jewelry boutique. Diamond earrings, a designer watch, pearl necklace. Total value, almost $68,000. Corporate client appreciation expenses. I frowned. We've never bought gifts like these for clients. We haven't. So who approved them? Thomas slowly turned the invoice over. Across the bottom appeared Charles's unmistakable signature. I closed the folder. He used company money. Thomas nodded. Repeatedly. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Finally, I asked, Does Michael know? Thomas considered the question carefully. I believe Michael knows enough to be uncomfortable. But not everything. No. That answer didn't surprise me. Charles had likely revealed only as much as necessary to each person. Compartmentalized information. Classic executive control. No one knew the complete picture, except perhaps Charles himself. And now, me. Before leaving, Thomas handed me a small flash drive. What's this? Digital accounting records. Backups. In case paper copies disappear. I looked at him. You think that could happen? I've worked in corporate finance long enough to prepare for every possibility. I slipped the drive into my purse. Thank you. As I reached the door, Thomas spoke again. Wilhelmina. Yes. I've watched you and Charles build this company since my first day. I know. I hope whatever happens. He paused. The company survives. I answered quietly. So do I. Leaving headquarters, I drove directly to another appointment. Margaret Ellis, our independent co-trustee. Margaret had never been close friends with either Charles or me. That was precisely why we had chosen her years earlier. Trustee should be independent, not loyal. She welcomed me into her office with her usual professional courtesy. What brings you here? I wanted to discuss the annual meeting. I assumed Charles would be handling that. He believes he will. Margaret studied me carefully. You disagree. I believe the meeting should follow every procedural requirement exactly. It always does. I mean every requirement. Her expression changed slightly. Is there something I should know? I shook my head. Not today. She remained silent. I simply wanted confirmation that no shortcuts will be taken. Margaret answered without hesitation. I've never taken shortcuts. I know. And I won't start now. That single sentence brought me enormous comfort. She didn't need to know the details. Only that procedure mattered. Procedure would soon become my greatest ally. That evening, Charles came home unusually cheerful. I've got good news. I looked up from the kitchen. Oh, the trustees seem very supportive. My heartbeat remained perfectly steady. Supportive of what? A few governance updates. Governance updates. That was how he described adding another woman to our family trust. I smiled pleasantly. I'm glad things are going well. He kissed my forehead. They are. As he walked upstairs, I watched him disappear around the corner. He looked relaxed, confident, victorious. For the first time in weeks, I understood why. Charles believed he was controlling the flow of information. He didn't know that Harold had preserved the original trust. He didn't know Thomas had preserved the financial records. I didn't know Margaret intended to follow every procedural rule without exception. Most importantly, he didn't know I had stopped thinking like a wife. I was thinking like the woman who had spent 40 years building a company, one document at a time. Later that night, after Charles had fallen asleep, I carried my growing collection of evidence into the study. Across the large oak desk, I created separate folders: trust documents, financial records, corporate expenses, travel reports, correspondence. Each page fit neatly into its place. When I finally stepped back, I counted nearly 200 pages of evidence, enough to answer questions, enough to expose patterns, enough to reveal a truth Charles believed remained hidden. I closed the final folder, locked the desk drawer, and glanced at the calendar hanging beside the window. Only 9 days remained until the annual trustee meeting. 9 days. For everyone else, it was simply another routine meeting. For Charles, it would be the day he expected to secure Vanessa's future. For me, it would be a day 42 years of careful preparation would finally begin speaking louder than promises ever could. The silence inside the boardroom felt almost sacred. Linda Foster looked around the table one final time. If there are no preliminary questions, we'll proceed with discussion. I slowly raised my hand. Not dramatically, not defiantly, simply as someone requesting permission to speak. Linda nodded. Mrs. Davenport. Every face in the room turned toward me. Charles smiled politely. He expected questions, perhaps even an emotional objection. He had prepared for both. He hadn't prepared for what came next. I stood smoothing the front of my navy jacket. Before discussing the proposed amendment, I said calmly, I would like to request that the governing trust language controlling beneficiary modifications be read into the official record. No one reacted immediately. Linda looked toward Harold Whitmore. Mr. Whitmore. Harold adjusted his glasses. That is an entirely appropriate procedural request. Charles shifted slightly in his chair. It isn't necessary. His interruption was polite but quick. The amendment packet already summarizes the relevant provisions. I turned toward him for the first time that morning. I didn't ask for the summary. My voice remained steady. I asked for the governing document. The room became very quiet. Linda glanced between Harold and Margaret Ellis. Margaret answered first. I agree with Mrs. Davenport. She folded her hands. The original governing language should always control. Charles forced a small smile. Of course. I simply don't want us wasting everyone's time. Harold calmly opened the original leather-bound trust. The governing instrument should never be considered a waste of time. Several trustees exchanged brief glances. I noticed Charles's smile tighten almost imperceptibly. It was the first crack. Harold turned several pages with practiced precision. I'll read Article 9, Section 4. He looked around the room before beginning. No amendment adding any person outside the bloodline or legally adopted descendants of the original settlers as a continuing income beneficiary shall become effective without written approval executed by both original settlers, provided both remain legally competent. His voice echoed softly across the boardroom. No one spoke. Harold continued. If both original settlers remain living and legally competent, the absence of written approval from either settler renders such amendment legally ineffective until properly executed. He closed the book. Silence. Absolute silence. For several seconds, the only sound came from the air conditioning vents. Linda slowly removed her reading glasses. Mr. Davenport? Charles looked composed. Yes. Do you possess written approval executed by Mrs. Davenport? He answered almost immediately. The amendment was prepared under legal guidance. Linda didn't blink. That wasn't my question. Another pause. Charles leaned back. I believed my authority as managing trustee was sufficient. Margaret quietly spoke. Authority as managing trustee differs from authority as original settler. Again. Silence. Vanessa looked confused. She glanced from Charles to Harold, then toward me. Clearly, this wasn't the meeting she expected. Charles straightened his papers. There appears to be a misunderstanding, Harold answered calmly. I don't believe there is. Charles looked directly at him. The trust has been amended before. Administrative provisions have. Exactly. Not beneficiary classifications involving unrelated individuals. Harold never raised his voice. He simply stated facts. Facts can be remarkably difficult to argue against. Charles turned toward Linda. I think we're getting lost in technicalities. That sentence changed the atmosphere of the room. Because trustees love technicalities. Technicalities are precisely what they're appointed to protect. Linda folded her hands. The governing language of a trust is never a technicality. She looked toward me. Mrs. Davenport. Did you execute written approval? No. Have you ever seen this amendment before today? No. Were you informed another beneficiary was being added? No. Every answer required only one word. Each one landed harder than the last. Linda made several notes. Margaret did the same. Charles finally looked genuinely uncomfortable. He turned toward me. Willie. It was the first time he'd used my nickname all morning. I intended to discuss it with you. I met his eyes. When? He hesitated. After today's meeting. Several trustees looked up immediately. Even Michael slowly raised his head. Charles realized what he'd admitted. Too late. I asked quietly. You intended to ask for my approval after requesting everyone else's. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. For the first time in over 40 years, I watched my husband search for words that didn't exist. Linda broke the silence. I believe we should pause discussion. Margaret nodded. I agree. Charles leaned forward. With respect, we're overreacting. Harold calmly slid another certified document across the table. I don't believe we are. Linda examined it. What is this? A certified copy of the original execution pages. She read silently, then looked toward me. Mrs. Davenport signed as original settler. Harold nodded. As did Mr. Davenport. Linda continued reading. Equal authority. She placed the document beside the trust. Charles shifted again. His confidence was beginning to disappear. Vanessa looked increasingly anxious. She leaned toward Charles and whispered something. He barely acknowledged her. For the first time that morning, she looked less like an honored guest, and more like someone realizing she had walked into the wrong room. Linda turned toward Harold again. I want absolute clarity. Harold nodded. Of course. If Mrs. Davenport never approved this amendment. Yes. Does that invalidate the beneficiary designation? Harold answered carefully. In my professional opinion. He paused deliberately. Yes. The word landed like a judge's gavel. Vanessa's face lost color. Michael closed his eyes. Jennifer quietly reached for his hand. Thomas remained perfectly still. Charles finally spoke. I disagree. Harold nodded respectfully. You're certainly entitled to. I retained competent counsel. I'm sure you did. They reviewed the amendment. I'm sure they reviewed what they received. Charles frowned. What does that mean? Harold opened another binder. It means outside counsel prepared an amendment. He tapped the original trust. They did not draft this. Several trustees leaned forward. Harold continued. They relied upon the documents supplied to them. Linda looked up sharply. Are you suggesting outside counsel may never have reviewed the controlling instrument? I'm suggesting I cannot confirm that they did. Charles interrupted. They had everything necessary. Harold looked directly at him. Then why does the amendment omit any acknowledgement of Article 9, Section 4? No answer. Harold asked another question. Where is Mrs. Davenport's written consent? Still no answer. Another. Where is documentation establishing her incapacity? Nothing. Another. Where is documentation surrendering her authority as original settler? Silence. Harold quietly closed the binder. I have no further questions. The room remained motionless. Linda took a slow breath. I believe procedural action is required. Charles spoke quickly. There's no need. There is. We can simply postpone implementation. Margaret looked directly at him. There has never been implementation. Another uncomfortable silence. Linda reviewed her notes. Before any vote, she looked around the table. I believe the trustees must first determine whether the proposed amendment is legally eligible for consideration. Charles leaned back heavily. His confidence had disappeared entirely. For the first time all morning, he looked at me not with irritation, but with genuine surprise, as though he suddenly realized I hadn't come to plead with him. I'd come prepared to defeat him. Yet I wasn't finished, not even close. Everything discussed so far concerned only one issue: procedure, legal authority, missing signatures. The trustees still hadn't heard a single word about the apartment, the jewelry, the travel, the corporate money. Those documents remained untouched inside my leather portfolio. Linda carefully arranged the papers before her. I therefore rule that discussion regarding beneficiary approval is suspended pending resolution of procedural validity. She looked toward Harold. Mr. Whitmore. Yes. I'll need your formal legal opinion entered into today's minutes. Certainly. Charles rubbed both hands across his face. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely frightened. Not because of me, because he finally understood something. He hadn't overlooked one forgotten clause. He had underestimated the woman who helped write the entire trust. I slowly reached into my leather portfolio. This time, instead of removing trust documents, I lifted a thick folder labeled in neat handwriting corporate financial records. Thomas noticed it immediately. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. Harold looked down. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Linda glanced toward me. Mrs. Davenport. Yes. Is there additional information relevant to today's discussion? I rested my hand gently on the unopened folder. Yes. I looked directly at Charles. There is. And I believe the trustees deserve to know how much the Davenport family has already paid. I paused. For the woman my husband wanted all of us to support. Every eye in the room shifted toward the thick financial file lying in front of me, and for the very first time since entering the boardroom, Charles looked not merely defeated, but afraid of what I might reveal next. For years I had watched Charles captivate boardrooms with confidence. He always knew exactly when to smile, when to pause, and when to lower his voice so people leaned in to hear him. That morning, however, something had changed. He wasn't controlling the room anymore. The room was controlling him. I rested my hand on the thick folder labeled Corporate Financial Records and looked toward Linda Foster. I'd like these documents entered into today's record. Linda nodded. Do they relate directly to the proposed amendment? They do. Harold spoke before Charles could interrupt. If Mrs. Davenport believes the documents establish a connection between trust administration and fiduciary conduct, the trustees should review them. Margaret Ellis agreed immediately. I concur. Linda extended her hand. I'll begin with the summary. I walked to the center of the boardroom and placed the folder before her. The room remained completely silent. Charles never took his eyes off the file. He knew exactly what it contained. He just didn't know how much I had. Linda opened the first page. At the top was a spreadsheet prepared by Thomas Reed. Every transaction had been arranged chronologically. Every receipt was attached. Every reimbursement reference supporting invoices. No assumptions. No accusations. Just numbers. Linda adjusted her glasses. Mr. Reed? Thomas stood. Yes, Madam Chair. Did you prepare this summary? I did. Are these official company records? Yes. Were they created specifically for today's meeting? No. They are compiled from our accounting system exactly as originally entered. Linda nodded. So these are business records maintained in the ordinary course? Correct. She looked toward Charles. Any objection to authenticity? Charles hesitated. No. His voice sounded noticeably weaker than before. Linda continued reading. The first category concerns executive housing expenses. She looked toward Thomas. Please explain. Thomas calmly walked to the presentation screen. Without saying a word, he connected his laptop. A detailed spreadsheet appeared. Executive housing program. Occupant. Address. Monthly cost. Approval authority. Every column was perfectly organized. Thomas pointed toward the highlighted line. Beginning approximately 16 months ago, corporate funds were used to lease a waterfront condominium for Ms. Vanessa Collins. He clicked to the next page. The address appeared. Luxury Harbor Residences, Charleston Harbor. Monthly lease, $7,050. Annual cost, $84,600. Utilities, reserved parking, cleaning services, furniture rental, insurance. Everything listed separately. Linda looked surprised. I wasn't aware Davenport Logistics maintained executive housing, Thomas answered plainly. We don't. Another silence. Linda frowned. Then why does this expense exist? Thomas turned toward Charles. It was approved by Mr. Davenport. Every head in the room slowly shifted toward my husband. Charles straightened in his chair. It was temporary. Thomas nodded politely. For 16 months. Charles didn't respond. Linda continued reading. The apartment was classified as... She paused. Operational necessity. She looked up. What operational necessity required permanent waterfront housing? Charles finally answered. Miss Collins relocated from North Carolina. Thomas quietly corrected him. Our records indicate she owned a home in Mount Pleasant throughout the same period. The room became still again. Charles blinked. Thomas continued. County property tax records confirm continued ownership. Harold quietly added, those records are public. Linda wrote several notes. Then she turned another page. Travel. Thomas advanced the presentation. Every executive conference attended by Charles over the previous year appeared. Beside nearly every trip was another line. Vanessa Collins. Same destination, same dates, different reservations. Linda looked toward Charles. Did Ms. Collins attend every conference? Most. For business? Yes. Thomas clicked again. Photographs appeared. Conference attendee lists, registration records, speaker schedules. Only one problem. Vanessa wasn't listed as a registered attendee at nearly half of them. Linda frowned. Mr. Reed, our accounting department reimbursed airfare and hotel expenses. But registration. There are no corresponding invoices. Margaret quietly asked. So the company paid travel expenses for conferences she did not officially attend? Thomas nodded. That appears to be correct. Charles leaned forward. She met privately with vendors. Thomas answered immediately. I requested supporting documentation. And none was provided. The trustees exchanged increasingly concerned glances. I remained silent. Facts were speaking for themselves. Linda turned another page. This time she paused much longer. Jewelry purchases. The room shifted uncomfortably. Thomas clicked again. High-resolution copies of invoices appeared on the screen. Diamond earrings, pearl necklace, luxury Swiss watch, designer bracelet. Total expenditures, $67, $842. Each invoice bore identical approval signatures. Charles Edward Davenport. Linda looked genuinely confused. Client appreciation, Thomas answered carefully. That was the accounting category selected. Linda looked around the room. Can anyone identify the client receiving these items? Nobody answered. Finally, Thomas spoke. The shipping address matched the executive apartment leased for Ms. Collins. Vanessa's eyes widened. She looked toward Charles. He refused to meet her gaze. For the first time since entering the meeting, I saw genuine uncertainty replace confidence in her expression. She hadn't expected this. Perhaps she believed Charles had purchased those gifts personally. Now she was learning they had been charged to the company. Linda closed the invoice slowly. Mr. Davenport. Charles finally looked up. Yes. Were company funds used to purchase personal gifts? No. Thomas quietly opened another document. May I clarify? Linda nodded. Thomas displayed the original accounting approval form. Across the bottom appeared Charles's handwritten instruction. Charge to executive relations. Thomas looked toward the trustees. No client name appears anywhere. Charles rubbed his forehead. I intended to reimburse the company. Thomas answered calmly. Our accounting records contain no reimbursement. Another pause. Linda asked, Did you ever submit repayment? No. Did anyone remind you? I forgot. That explanation lingered awkwardly inside the room. Forgot. Nearly $70,000. Forgot. No one looked convinced. Harold remained perfectly still beside me. Exactly as we'd planned. No emotional arguments, only evidence. Linda continued reading. The next section concerns corporate credit cards. Thomas displayed another spreadsheet. Restaurant charges, private clubs, weekend resort expenses, wine purchases, spa services. Every expense occurred on weekends. Many occurred when no corporate meetings were scheduled. Linda frowned. Were these business entertainment? Charles answered quickly. Relationship development. Thomas quietly clicked again. A calendar appeared beside the expenses. No client meetings. No board events. No vendor appointments. Only weekends. Holiday weekends. Valentine's Day. New Year's Eve. Anniversary weekend. Even Margaret Ellis slowly removed her glasses. She no longer looked skeptical. She looked disappointed. Linda leaned back in her chair. I need clarification. She looked directly at Charles. Were corporate assets repeatedly used for personal purposes? Charles opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Finally, he answered. Some expenses may have been misclassified. Thomas quietly replied. Over 16 months. No one spoke. The room felt almost unbearably quiet. Then something happened I hadn't expected. Vanessa slowly raised her hand. Everyone turned toward her. Linda nodded cautiously. Ms. Collins. Vanessa's voice trembled. She swallowed. I thought Charles paid for the apartment. She looked directly at me. He told me the company owned executive housing. Nobody interrupted. He told me gifts came from his personal account. Tears began filling her eyes. I didn't know. Charles finally looked toward her. Vanessa? She turned sharply. You said everything was approved. No answer. You told me Wilhelmina had retired. Silence. You told me she didn't care about the business anymore. Charles whispered, This isn't the place. Vanessa stood. I think it is. The room froze. For the first time, she wasn't looking at Charles with admiration. She was looking at him with betrayal. Exactly the same betrayal I had carried for weeks. Different reasons, same pain. Linda gently tapped her pen against the table. I believe the trustees have received sufficient preliminary financial information. She looked toward every trustee individually. I'd like to hear whether anyone believes these records are irrelevant to Mr. Davenport's fiduciary responsibilities. No one answered. Not one person. Linda nodded slowly. I didn't think so. She carefully closed the financial binder. Then she looked directly at Charles. Her voice remained calm, professional, measured. Mr. Davenport. Yes. Before this meeting proceeds any further. She paused. I believe the board must now determine whether your conduct as managing trustee itself has compromised your ability to continue serving in that role. For the first time in 42 years, I watched Charles Davenport realize he was no longer defending an amendment. He was defending his entire career. And judging by the expressions around that table, he was losing far more than a vote. I had imagined this moment many different ways. In some versions, Vanessa would deny everything. In others, she would blame me, accuse me of trying to protect my pride, or insist that Charles and I had already drifted apart long before she entered our lives. I never imagined she would look as frightened as I felt. After Linda Foster announced that the trustees would examine Charles's conduct before considering any amendment, no one spoke for several long seconds. Vanessa remained standing beside the wall, her eyes fixed on Charles. "I asked you a question," she said quietly. "You told me everything was approved." Charles looked around the room before answering. "This isn't the time." It became the time the moment everyone learned my name. Her voice trembled, but she didn't sit down. "I deserve an answer." Charles sighed. "Vanessa." "No," she shook her head. "Not another conversation where you tell me to trust you." The confidence she had carried into the room was gone. The woman who had entered believing she was about to secure her future now looked like someone discovering that every promise she had built her life around rested on sand. Linda spoke gently. "Ms. Collins, if you have information directly relevant to the proposed amendment or the administration of this trust, the board is willing to hear it." Charles immediately objected. "I don't believe that's appropriate." Margaret Ellis looked at him calmly. "You've already presented your position. The board is entitled to hear from anyone directly affected." Charles turned toward Harold. "This is becoming a trial." Harold answered evenly. "No. It's becoming a fact-finding meeting." Those words settled over the room. Vanessa slowly sat down, then looked back toward Linda. "I never wanted any of this." No one interrupted. "I met Charles almost 2 years ago." She folded her hands together to stop them from shaking. "I was hired to review logistics contracts after a regional acquisition." Thomas Reed nodded once. "That is accurate," Vanessa continued. "He told me he admired the way I worked." "At first that was all," she smiled sadly. "We traveled together because of the job. Eventually those trips became dinners. Dinners became weekends. I asked him more than once whether he was still committed to his marriage." Every eye in the room shifted toward Charles. Vanessa continued before he could respond. "He said the marriage had been over for years." I felt Michael tense beside me. "He said you and he stayed together only because of appearances." Her eyes found mine. "He told me you had retired from the company because you wanted nothing more to do with business." I answered quietly. "I never said that." "I know." She lowered her head. "I know that now." She took a slow breath. "He also told me that the family trust had already been updated." My heartbeat remained steady. "He said you supported his decisions." "No." "He said adding me wasn't taking anything away from your children." Again I said nothing. She looked toward Linda. "I believed him." Charles finally spoke. "Vanessa, enough." She turned sharply. "No." For almost 2 years, every difficult question I asked had the same answer. She looked directly at him. "Trust me." The room remained perfectly silent. Then she reached into her leather handbag. "I have something." Charles's face changed instantly. A flash of genuine alarm crossed it. "Vanessa." She ignored him. From her bag she removed a slim envelope tied with a blue ribbon. "I almost didn't bring this," Linda asked carefully. "What is it?" "Copies of emails." Charles stood abruptly. "Those are private." Harold looked at Linda. "They may also be relevant." Linda nodded. "They'll be marked confidential until reviewed." Vanessa walked to the center of the room and placed the envelope on the conference table. "I printed them after Charles started delaying the trust meeting." She looked exhausted. "I thought," she laughed bitterly, "I thought maybe he was getting cold feet." Instead, she had walked into a room where she learned the amendment should never have existed in the first place. Linda opened the envelope. Inside were dozens of printed emails. She skimmed the first page before handing it to Harold. His expression remained composed, but I noticed him raise one eyebrow. He passed the page to Margaret. Neither spoke immediately. Finally, Linda asked, "Mr. Whitmore?" Harold answered carefully. "The correspondence appears authentic." Charles folded his arms. "They're personal. They're relevant." Harold turned one page. "This email references the proposed trust amendment." Another page. "This one discusses delaying disclosure." Another. "This one states—" He paused. "Willie never reads the trust documents anymore." The room became painfully quiet. I recognized the sentence immediately. Charles had written it. Not because Harold said so. Because I knew his phrasing, his habit of shortening my name, his confidence, his assumption. Willie never reads the trust documents anymore. He had underestimated me long before this meeting. Harold continued reading silently. Then another sentence caught his attention. "Once the trustees approve everything, there won't be anything she can do." Margaret slowly removed her glasses. "That statement concerns me." "So does this." Harold turned another page. "Don't worry. Harold isn't handling the amendment. The new attorneys won't ask unnecessary questions." Linda looked directly at Charles. "Did you intentionally retain different legal counsel to avoid review of the original governing documents?" Charles hesitated. "I retained a firm specializing in trust updates." "Please answer the question." "I wanted efficiency." Harold quietly replied, "Efficiency and scrutiny are not the same thing." Vanessa spoke again. "I never knew there was another reason." She looked toward me. "I thought changing attorneys was normal." I believed everything had already been discussed. Tears rolled down her cheeks. "I wasn't trying to take your family away." For the first time since discovering her name in our trust, I believed her. Not because she was innocent. She wasn't. She had entered a relationship with a married man. That decision carried its own responsibility. But she hadn't created the deception. Charles had. She had been manipulated by the same man who had manipulated all of us. Linda leaned back. "Ms. Collins." "Yes." "If these emails accurately reflect your communications with Mr. Davenport." "They do." "Why bring them today?" Vanessa answered without hesitation. "Because this morning I realized I don't actually know the man I thought I loved." No one moved. She wiped away another tear. "If he lied to his wife." She swallowed hard. "And if he lied to the trustees?" Her voice cracked. "Then he probably lied to me too." Charles closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, the certainty that had defined him all morning had disappeared. He looked tired, older, almost defeated. Michael spoke for the first time since the meeting began. "Dad." Charles slowly turned toward him. "Did you ever intend to tell Mom the truth?" Charles stared at his son for several moments. Finally, he answered, "I was trying to find the right time." Michael shook his head. "There wasn't one." Jennifer quietly reached for Michael's hand again. Across the room, Thomas Reed remained expressionless, though I noticed him making careful notes for the official record. Linda looked around the table. "I believe we've now heard enough testimony to establish one thing beyond dispute." Everyone waited. There was no informed consent. She looked toward me. There was no written approval. Toward Vanessa. There were material misrepresentations. Toward Charles. And there appears to have been intentional concealment. The words were measured, professional, but devastating. I looked at Charles. For 42 years, he had been the strongest person in every room we entered together. Now he sat alone at the end of the table, surrounded not by enemies, but by the consequences of his own choices. I felt no satisfaction, only sadness, because no matter what happened next, the man I had built my entire adult life beside no longer existed. He had disappeared long before this meeting. The trustees were only discovering what I had already begun mourning weeks ago. Linda closed the confidential file and rested both hands on the table. "I believe the board is prepared to deliberate." She looked directly at Margaret Ellis. "Unless there are further questions." Margaret slowly nodded. "I have one." She turned toward Charles. It was a simple question. Only 7 words. When did you stop protecting your family? For the first time all morning, Charles had no answer. Margaret Ellis's question lingered over the boardroom like a church bell after Sunday service. When did you stop protecting your family? No one looked away from Charles, not even Vanessa, especially not me. For nearly a full minute, the only sound came from the faint hum of the air conditioning. Finally, Charles leaned back in his chair and exhaled. I don't know. It was the first completely honest thing he had said all morning. Linda Foster folded her hands. Thank you. She looked around the table. Unless there are additional factual issues requiring testimony, I believe the board should move into deliberation. Harold nodded. I agree. Thomas closed his laptop. Vanessa quietly returned to her seat. No one spoke. The trustees weren't rushing because they understood the gravity of what sat before them. They weren't deciding the fate of a business transaction. They were deciding whether the man who had spent decades leading our family trust still deserved the authority entrusted to him. Linda spoke again. Before we deliberate, Mr. Davenport, you are entitled to make a final statement. Charles remained seated. For the first time in decades, he looked older than his 67 years. His shoulders had sunk. The confidence that once filled every room had disappeared. He looked around the table slowly. I never intended to hurt anyone. No one interrupted. I know that's difficult to believe. He glanced toward me. Especially for you, Willie. I didn't respond. I convinced myself I could separate my personal life from the company. He laughed quietly. I was wrong. Michael stared silently at his father. Charles continued. I believed Vanessa deserved security. He looked toward her. I also believed I had earned the right to make those decisions. Harold quietly wrote something in his notes. Charles noticed. I understand how that sounds, Linda asked gently. Do you acknowledge that the amendment violated the governing trust provisions? Charles hesitated, then slowly nodded. Yes. Do you acknowledge that Mrs. Davenport never approved it? Yes. Do you acknowledge that company resources were used for personal purposes? Another pause. Finally, yes. No excuses. No explanations. Just one word. The admission settled heavily over the room. Linda thanked him. Your cooperation is noted. She looked toward Margaret. I move that the trustees enter executive deliberation. Margaret nodded. So moved. Another trustee seconded the motion. Linda looked around the room. Only trustees trust counsel, and the recording secretary will remain. She turned toward me. As an original settler, Mrs. Davenport may remain. Charles slowly stood. I'll wait outside. No one stopped him. Vanessa quietly rose as well. Before leaving, she looked at me. I truly am sorry. There was nothing rehearsed about the apology, only exhaustion. I simply nodded. I know. She blinked in surprise, then walked out without another word. The boardroom door closed. For the first time all day, only the people legally responsible for protecting the Davenport family trust remained inside. Linda looked around the room. Let's begin. Margaret spoke first. The proposed amendment cannot legally proceed. No disagreement. Agreed, another trustee said. Linda wrote the motion. Any opposition? None. She marked it unanimously approved. The proposed beneficiary amendment is declared invalid. I felt my shoulders relax. The amendment was dead. But the meeting wasn't over. Margaret looked toward Charles's empty chair. The more difficult question concerns fiduciary responsibility. Linda nodded. I agree. She turned toward Thomas. Mr. Reed. Yes. In your professional opinion, did Mr. Davenport repeatedly authorize expenditures outside ordinary corporate purposes? Thomas answered without hesitation. Yes. Did accounting records support reimbursement? No. Were disclosures complete? No. Thank you. Linda looked toward Harold. Legal opinion. Harold folded his hands. A trustee owes duties of loyalty, care, and good faith. He paused. The evidence presented today establishes repeated failures in each category. No one challenged him. One trustee, a retired judge named Robert Sinclair, finally spoke. I've reviewed trust disputes for decades. He looked around the table. What concerns me most isn't the affair. Everyone listened carefully. It's concealment. He tapped the trust agreement. He didn't merely exercise poor judgment. He attempted to alter governing documents while withholding required consent. Another trustee nodded. That destroys confidence. Margaret quietly added, and trust administration depends entirely upon confidence. Linda summarized. The issue before us is whether Charles Davenport should continue serving as managing trustee. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable silence. Thoughtful silence. Finally, Robert Sinclair raised his hand. I move that Charles Davenport be immediately removed as managing trustee. Another trustee seconded. Linda recorded the motion. Before calling the vote, she looked at me. Mrs. Davenport. Yes. As original settler, you aren't required to vote. I understand. But you may offer comments if you wish. Every eye turned toward me. This was the moment many people would have chosen revenge. 42 years, a mistress, corporate funds, public humiliation. Few would have blamed me for demanding everything Charles owned. Instead, I stood slowly. I don't hate Charles. Several trustees looked surprised. I hate the choices he made. I looked toward the empty chair where my husband had been sitting. We built this trust because we believed future generations deserved protection. My concern today isn't my marriage. It's whether our grandchildren inherit integrity. I rested one hand on the original trust agreement. Or manipulation. The room remained completely silent. I don't ask this board to punish Charles. I ask you to protect the trust. Nothing more, nothing less. I sat down. Margaret looked at me for several seconds before quietly saying, "Thank you." Linda nodded. I believe we're ready. She looked around the table. All trustees in favor of removing Charles Davenport as managing trustee effective immediately. One hand rose, then another, then another. Margaret, Robert, Linda, every independent trustee, one after another, unanimous. Linda lowered her pen. The motion carries. No applause, no celebration, only quiet acceptance. The decision felt less like victory and more like the closing of a very old chapter. Linda continued. The board must now appoint interim management. Before anyone spoke, Michael slowly raised his hand. I'd like to decline consideration. Everyone looked toward him. He continued quietly. I don't believe I should replace my father today. Not under these circumstances. I recommend Mrs. Davenport serve until the next annual review. The room fell silent again. I looked at my son in surprise. Linda smiled gently. Mrs. Davenport, would you accept temporary appointment? I hadn't expected the question. Not once during the past 3 weeks had I imagined leading the trust myself. I looked toward Harold. He gave only the slightest nod. Finally, I answered. If the board believes it's best for the family, I'll serve. Another unanimous vote followed. Linda extended her hand across the table. Congratulations, Mrs. Davenport. I shook it, not because I'd won, because responsibility had just become mine again. The boardroom door opened. Charles walked back inside. He immediately read the room. No one needed to speak. He already knew. Linda addressed him respectfully. Mr. Davenport? The trustees have concluded deliberation. He nodded once. The amendment, rejected unanimously. He closed his eyes briefly. And, you have been removed as managing trustee effective immediately. No visible anger, no shouting, no argument. He simply stood there, very still. Finally, he looked at me. I suppose this is where you celebrate. I shook my head. No. Why not? Because 42 years of my life just ended. Those words struck him harder than any accusation could have. He lowered his eyes. For the first time since I met him in college, Charles Davenport looked like a man who fully understood the cost of his own decisions, not the financial cost, the human one. As he quietly gathered his papers, no one tried to stop him. No one escorted him out. No one humiliated him. The consequences themselves were heavy enough. Just before reaching the door, he turned back. "I'll resign from the company, too," Linda answered professionally. "That matter belongs to the corporate board." Charles nodded. "I understand." Then he looked at me one final time. "I'm sorry, Willie." The words were sincere. Perhaps the most sincere words he'd spoken in years. But some apologies arrive long after they still have the power to change anything. He quietly opened the door, walked out. And for the first time in more than 4 decades, Charles Davenport left the family trust without any authority to return. When the boardroom finally emptied, I didn't feel victorious. I felt exhausted. People often imagine justice as a triumphant moment, a dramatic speech, a courtroom verdict, or the satisfying look on someone's face when they finally lose. Real justice is quieter than that. It asks you to keep standing long after the adrenaline disappears. As trustees gathered their documents and thanked one another, I remained seated. The original trust agreement still rested in front of me. I gently ran my fingertips across the worn leather cover. 22 years earlier, Charles and I had signed those papers together. We had laughed with Harold afterward, gone to lunch, and talked about how wonderful it would be to leave something meaningful behind for our children. Neither of us had imagined the trust would one day protect our family from one of its own founders. Harold quietly packed his briefcase. "You did well." I smiled faintly. "I don't feel like I won." "You weren't supposed to." He rested one hand on the back of his chair. "You were supposed to protect the trust." "I suppose I did." "You did." He looked toward the closed boardroom door. "The rest will take time." He was right. Legal decisions happen in hours. Healing takes much longer. As I stepped into the hallway, Michael was waiting. He had been pacing outside for nearly 20 minutes. The moment he saw me, he stopped. "Mom." I nodded. "It's over." He searched my face. "How bad?" I considered the question carefully. "The trust is safe." "And Dad?" "He was removed as managing trustee." Michael lowered his head. I figured. Neither of us moved. Finally, he asked, "Can we talk?" Instead of answering, I walked toward the large windows overlooking the river. He followed. For several moments, we simply stood there watching cargo ships move slowly across the harbor. It reminded me of all the years Charles and I had spent building a shipping company from almost nothing. Eventually, Michael spoke. "I failed you." I turned toward him. "No. I did." "You were scared." "I was a coward." His voice cracked on the last word. "I kept telling myself I was protecting everyone." He laughed bitterly. "I wasn't protecting anyone." I remained quiet. Sometimes people need to hear themselves tell the truth. I watched Dad change. He stared out the window. Little by little. I noticed he stopped asking your opinion. I noticed he made Vanessa part of every important meeting. I noticed people whispered whenever you weren't around. He swallowed hard. And I did nothing. I stepped closer. "Why?" He answered immediately. "Because he was still my father." Those 6 words explained everything. Children carry impossible burdens when parents begin falling apart. No matter how old they become, part of them still hopes both parents can somehow be saved. I thought if I ignored it, he shook his head, maybe it would disappear. I gently touched his arm. "That's what I hoped too." He looked surprised. "You did?" "I ignored warning signs for almost a year. I kept believing the man I married would eventually come back." He whispered, "He didn't." "No. He didn't." Michael wiped his eyes. "I don't know how to fix this." "You can't." "I want to." "I know." For the first time since he was a little boy, he leaned forward and hugged me. Not because he needed comfort, because he needed forgiveness. "I love you, Mom. I love you too. No matter what happens with Dad, I know. You'll always have me." Those words meant more than he probably realized, because betrayal has a way of making people question everything, even love, even family, especially family. When Michael left, Jennifer was waiting near the elevators. The moment she saw me, tears filled her eyes. "I'm so sorry." I smiled gently. You've already said that. It doesn't feel like enough. She wrapped her arms around me. I should have told you months ago. I hugged her back. You wanted to. I should have ignored Michael. No. She looked confused. He needed time too. I wasn't the only person Charles betrayed. Jennifer frowned. What do you mean? He taught all of us to stay silent. I looked toward the now empty boardroom. Today we finally stopped, she nodded slowly. I hadn't thought of it that way. We stood together for a few moments before another familiar voice interrupted. Grandma. I turned. Benjamin. My 16-year-old grandson. He had apparently been waiting downstairs with Jennifer. He looked uncertain, almost afraid to approach. I smiled. Come here. He walked over quietly. I heard everyone talking. I'm sure you did. I don't know exactly what happened. You don't need to. He hesitated. Is Grandpa okay? Children, even teenagers, often ask the most important questions. Not whether someone was right, not whether someone won. Simply, are they okay? I hope he will be. Benjamin nodded. I've been worried. Why? He looked embarrassed. I saw Grandpa with that lady once. My heart skipped. When last spring. What happened? I was downtown with my friends. He shrugged. They were eating ice cream. Grandpa told me not to mention it because he wanted to surprise you with a business announcement. He looked down. I believed him. Another small piece of the story. Another person Charles had asked to carry part of his secret. I gently placed my hand on Benjamin's shoulder. Listen to me. He looked up. You did nothing wrong. I should have told you. You were trying to trust your grandfather. His eyes filled with tears. I feel stupid. I smiled sadly. No. You feel disappointed. There's a difference. He nodded. I don't want everyone to hate Grandpa. Neither did I. That realization surprised me. After everything that had happened, after the affair, the lies, the trust, the money, I still didn't want my grandchildren growing up believing people become only the worst thing they've ever done. I knelt so we were eye level. Benjamin. Yes. Your grandfather made terrible decisions. He nodded. But that doesn't erase every good thing he ever did. It doesn't. No. It simply means both things are true. He loved you. And he also failed us. Life rarely fits neatly into heroes and villains, especially families. Benjamin wrapped his arms around me. I love you. I love you too. As he walked away with Jennifer, I noticed Emily standing near the far end of the hallway. She hadn't said a word all morning. Not during the meeting, not afterward. She simply watched. I slowly walked toward her. She met me halfway. Before either of us spoke, she burst into tears. I believed him. She covered her face. I believed every word. I gently lowered her hands. He was your father. I'm an estate planning attorney. She laughed bitterly. I teach people every day about trust documents. And I never questioned my own father. You loved him. I failed professionally. No. You were his daughter before you were anyone's attorney. She shook her head. I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation. I smiled softly. So did I. She looked at me for a long time. Can you ever forgive him? The question lingered between us. I answered honestly. I don't know. Do you want to? I thought carefully before speaking. I want to stop carrying anger. That's different. Emily nodded slowly. It is. As we walked towards the parking garage together, I realized something remarkable. Today's meeting hadn't repaired our family, not even close. But it had done something equally important. It had ended the silence. For months, perhaps years, everyone had carried separate pieces of the truth. Today, those pieces finally came together. And only after truth was spoken aloud could healing even begin. Behind us, the boardroom lights switched off one by one. The meeting was over. The hardest conversations, however, were only beginning. People often believe healing begins the day justice is served. It doesn't. Justice simply clears away the wreckage. Healing begins the morning after when you wake up and discover that life is still waiting for you. 3 weeks after the trustee meeting, I unlocked the door to the family trust office with a key I had carried for years but rarely used. The brass nameplate outside had already been updated. Davenport Family Trust. Acting Managing Trustee, Wilhelmina Davenport. I stood there for a long moment before stepping inside. Nothing about the office had changed. Charles's books still lined the shelves. The framed photograph of our first warehouse still hung beside the window. Even his favorite fountain pen remained in the desk drawer. The room felt strangely frozen, as though it hadn't yet accepted that someone else now occupied the chair behind the desk. I didn't remove any of his personal belongings. Not immediately. This office represented 40 years of our shared work. Erasing him would have been dishonest. Instead, I placed one small framed photograph beside the computer. It showed our entire family gathered around my mother's dining table nearly 10 years earlier. Charles stood with one arm around Michael. Emily held Benjamin on her lap. Jennifer laughed at something outside the frame. No one in that picture knew what the future held. Looking at it reminded me why I had accepted this responsibility, not to defeat Charles, to protect those people. The first weeks were consumed by meetings, lawyers, auditors, accountants, trust administrators. Every conversation began with the same question: what safeguards would you like to implement? The answer surprised even me. I don't want more power. I want less opportunity for abuse. Margaret Ellis smiled when I said it. That's exactly the right answer. Together we reviewed every governance policy. Some rules dated back more than 2 decades, others had never been updated. Harold joined several sessions. Thomas prepared detailed financial analyses. By the end of the second week, we had drafted a series of reforms. Every amendment to the trust would now require unanimous trustee review before reaching a vote. Any proposed beneficiary changes would automatically trigger an independent legal review. All trustee expenses would undergo quarterly external audits. Corporate expenditures involving trustees would require dual authorization. No single individual, including me, could approve significant distributions alone. Michael looked over the proposals carefully. You've made it almost impossible for one person to control everything. I smiled. Exactly. He nodded. I like it. So do I. One afternoon, after a particularly long meeting, Margaret remained behind. She closed her notebook. I have something for you. She slid an envelope across the desk. What is it? A letter. From whom? She hesitated. Charles. I looked at the envelope for several seconds without touching it. He asked that it be delivered after the governance review was complete. I finally picked it up. The handwriting on the front was instantly familiar. 42 years of birthday cards, anniversary notes, shopping lists, business reminders. I would have recognized Charles's handwriting anywhere. After Margaret left, I sat alone for nearly 20 minutes before opening it. The letter wasn't long. Willie, I spent most of my life believing I knew how to solve problems. Now I realize I spent the last few years creating them. I've had plenty of time to think since leaving the company. For the first time in decades, nobody asks me to make decisions. The silence has forced me to hear my own mistakes. I betrayed you. I betrayed our children. I betrayed the trust we built. No explanation changes that. I've already signed the paperwork, resigning from every remaining trustee position. I'm also selling my personal company shares back to the trust under the valuation Harold recommended. Not because anyone forced me, because they were never supposed to become tools for hurting our family. I don't expect forgiveness. I only hope one day our grandchildren remember me for more than my worst decision. Charles. I folded the letter carefully, not because I was overwhelmed, because it deserved to be preserved. Accountability matters. So does remorse. Neither erases the past, but both influence the future. A week later, Michael visited my office carrying another folder. I've finished reviewing the operational transition. Everything in order. Almost. He smiled awkwardly. There's one more thing. He handed me a resignation letter. I frowned. What is this? My resignation as Chief Operating Officer. I looked up immediately. Absolutely not. He laughed softly. I knew you'd say that. Then why bring it? Because I wanted to explain. He sat across from me. I kept asking myself why I stayed silent. I listened. It wasn't only fear. What else? I depended too much on Dad. He looked around the office. I don't ever want anyone, including you, to have that much unchecked influence again. So, I'd like to continue working. I smiled. I was hoping you would. But under one condition. What condition? I report to the board, not to family. I leaned back. I think that's an excellent condition. His shoulders visibly relaxed. I was afraid you'd think I was abandoning you. I reached across the desk and squeezed his hand. Michael. Yes. You're helping protect us. The next major change came from Emily. As an estate planning attorney, she volunteered to review educational materials for future beneficiaries. I've been thinking. She spread several draft documents across the conference table. Most families only teach children how to inherit money. She smiled sadly. We never teach them how to inherit responsibility. The sentence stayed with me. Over the following month, Emily developed what became known as the Davenport Legacy Program. Every grandchild would receive age-appropriate financial education before becoming eligible for trust distributions. They would learn how trusts work, why fiduciary duty matters, how transparency protects families, why wealth without integrity rarely survives. Benjamin became the first participant. One Saturday afternoon, he sat across from Emily asking questions about legal documents instead of video games. Watching him made me unexpectedly hopeful. Perhaps every painful experience could still leave behind something worthwhile. Late that autumn, the trustees gathered once more, not for an annual meeting, simply to approve the final governance revisions. Linda Foster reviewed the completed package. This is considerably stronger than the original. Harold smiled. As every generation hopes to leave things. Margaret looked toward me. You've changed more than legal language. How so? You've changed the culture. I wasn't sure I deserved that credit. Perhaps the culture had changed because everyone finally understood how fragile trust truly was. As the meeting ended, Linda handed me the final execution copy. Congratulations. It's officially complete. I looked down at the newly revised trust agreement. Not one clause mentioned Charles. Not one clause mentioned Vanessa. Their names didn't belong there. The trust wasn't meant to preserve betrayal. It was meant to preserve family. As everyone prepared to leave, I remained alone in the conference room for a few moments. Outside the window, the sun slowly disappeared behind Charleston Harbor. I opened the first page of the revised trust. Beneath the title appeared a new statement we had unanimously approved. The purpose of this trust is not merely to preserve wealth, but to preserve integrity for every generation that follows. I smiled quietly. Money had built our company. Integrity would now protect it. And for the first time in many months, I believed the Davenport family's future rested on something far stronger than fortune. It rested on lessons we had paid dearly to learn. 1 year later, I unlocked the boardroom with the same brass key I had carried in my purse for decades. Only this time I wasn't entering as someone's wife. I was entering as the chair of the annual meeting. The morning sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Charleston Harbor, painting long golden reflections across the polished mahogany table. For years I had associated this room with contracts, votes, and financial reports. Now I thought of it differently. This room had become the place where truth finally caught up with deception. I arrived almost an hour early. Old habits die slowly. I arranged every binder in front of each trustee, placed bottled water at every seat, checked the projector, reviewed the agenda one final time. Some people found it strange that I still preferred doing small tasks myself. I never did. Success had never made me believe ordinary work belonged to someone else. As I finished arranging the last folder, the boardroom door opened. Benjamin stepped inside carrying 2 cups of coffee. He had grown nearly 4 inches during the past year. At 17, he was beginning to resemble Michael more every month. I figured you'd get here early. I smiled. You know me well. He handed me 1 cup. Black coffee. Exactly right. He looked around the room. It feels different. It is. No. He smiled. I mean the room. I looked carefully. He was right. The photographs still hung on the walls. The furniture hadn't changed. Neither had the view. Yet the atmosphere felt lighter. Secrets have remarkable weight. Once they're gone, even familiar places breathe differently. Benjamin walked toward the large window. I've been reading The Trust. I laughed softly. I never thought I'd hear a 17-year-old say that. He shrugged. Grandpa always wanted me to understand the business. The mention of Charles no longer made the room uncomfortable. Time had softened some of the sharpest edges, not erased them, simply softened them. Benjamin continued. I think I understand now. What? Why you fought so hard. I joined him at the window. I wasn't fighting for money. I know. You were fighting so we'd still trust each other. His words surprised me. For someone his age, he understood something many adults never do. Money can be replaced, trust cannot. The rest of the trustees gradually arrived. Margaret Ellis greeted me with her usual composed smile. Ready? I think so. Harold Whitmore looked healthier than he had the previous year. Retirement suited him. Thomas Reed placed the latest financial reports neatly beside each agenda. Michael entered with several operations updates. Emily carried a folder labeled Legacy Education Program, Annual Review. Jennifer brought homemade cinnamon rolls because she insisted serious meetings shouldn't begin on an empty stomach. The atmosphere felt nothing like the previous year's meeting. People smiled naturally. No one whispered. No one avoided eye contact. No one wondered what someone else might be hiding. At exactly 9:30, I tapped the small wooden gavel Linda Foster had presented to me after accepting permanent appointment as managing trustee. I call this meeting to order. The words felt surprisingly natural. Routine business proceeded smoothly. Investment performance exceeded expectations. The company had enjoyed its strongest year in nearly a decade. Independent audits found no governance concerns. The legacy education program had expanded to include every grandchild over the age of 14 for the first time in years. Every trustee report ended with the same conclusion: full compliance, complete transparency, healthy governance. Near the end of the meeting, Emily presented a summary from the educational program. She smiled proudly. Benjamin has completed every module. Margaret looked impressed. Congratulations. Benjamin smiled awkwardly. I actually enjoyed them. Everyone laughed. Emily continued. He submitted a written reflection. She looked toward him. Would you mind sharing part of it? Benjamin looked embarrassed. It's not that important. I think it is. After a moment, he unfolded a single sheet of paper. My grandfather taught me how to build something successful. He paused. My grandmother taught me how to protect it. The room fell silent. I used to think inheritance meant receiving money. He looked around the table. Now I think inheritance means receiving values that deserve protecting. No one spoke for several seconds. I felt tears forming in my eyes, not because of sadness, because hope sometimes arrives quietly. Benjamin folded the paper. I'm done. Everyone applauded softly. Harold leaned toward me. You've accomplished something rare. What? You turned a family crisis into a family lesson. I wasn't sure I deserved that credit. Everyone had contributed. Michael by accepting accountability. Emily by educating the next generation. Jennifer by choosing honesty over comfort. Thomas by remaining loyal to truth instead of personalities. Margaret and Linda by protecting procedure rather than friendships. Even Charles, in an unexpected way, had contributed too, because consequences teach lessons that advice rarely can. As the meeting concluded, Linda announced one final item. We received correspondence addressed to the trustees. She handed me a sealed envelope. No return address. She smiled. There is. I looked at the corner. Vanessa Collins. I hadn't heard her name in nearly a year. Carefully, I opened the envelope. Inside rested a handwritten letter. Mrs. Davenport, I've started over in Colorado. I'm working for a nonprofit organization helping women rebuild their careers after difficult life changes. No one here knows my past unless I choose to tell them. I've spent many months thinking about the pain I helped create. I can't undo it. I also can't pretend I wasn't responsible for my own choices. Charles deceived me, but I chose to believe what was convenient instead of asking harder questions. For that, I will always be sorry. Thank you for showing me more grace than I deserved that day in the boardroom. You could have tried to destroy my life. Instead, you simply chose to tell the truth. Truth changed me more than revenge ever could. I hope your family has found peace. Vanessa. I carefully folded the letter. No one asked to read it. No one needed to. Some apologies belong only to the person receiving them. After the meeting ended, everyone gradually left. Michael and Jennifer headed back to headquarters. Emily returned to Atlanta. Thomas gathered financial binders. Harold promised to visit again before Christmas. Eventually, I found myself alone inside the boardroom once more, just as I had 1 year earlier. The difference was profound. Last year, I had walked into this room carrying evidence. Today, I walked out carrying peace. Before leaving, I paused beside the large photograph of Charles and me standing in front of our very first truck. We looked impossibly young, hopeful, certain the future belonged to us. I smiled at the photograph. Not because I wanted those years back, because I had finally accepted them exactly as they were. Beautiful, complicated, real. Charles and I eventually finalized our divorce quietly. There were no public arguments, no courtroom battles, only paperwork and difficult conversations. Several months later, he moved to a small coastal town in North Carolina. Michael told me he volunteered twice a week at a veterans' food pantry. Sometimes people asked whether I had forgiven him. My answer never changed. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It isn't pretending betrayal never happened. Forgiveness is refusing to let someone else's worst decision become the permanent author of your future. As I switched off the boardroom lights and locked the door behind me, I looked once more toward Charleston Harbor. The river continued flowing exactly as it always had. Never backward. Always forward. Life does the same if we're willing to let it.